Good morning. My name is Sharon Austin, and it gives me great pleasure today to give this presentation. I'm currently participating in another conference, so this is a pre-recorded presentation that I want to give to you about African American women and cooperatives. So I want to go ahead and share my screen to give you an idea of what I'll be talking about. I'm assuming you can see that. This is the title of my presentation. Let me just move this out of the way. The Solidarity Economic Efforts of African American Women in the United States. And again, it gives me great pleasure to be here with you virtually today. My name is Dr. Sharon Austin, and I'm professor of political science at the University of Florida. This tells you a little bit about me, about my background. I'm originally from the city of Memphis, Tennessee. I graduated with a doctorate in political science from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I've been a professor at the University of Florida since 2001. These are some of the forthcoming books that I have coming out within the next probably 3 years or so. The first book is entitled Beyond Racial Capitalism, Cooperatives in the African Diaspora, that I'm editing along with Caroline Hossain of the University of Toronto and Mr. Kevin Edmonds, also the University of Toronto. The other book is African Diaspora Economics, and I'm co-authoring with several people. And finally, I have another book that I've been working on for a few years, Political Black Girl Magic, The Elections and Governance of Black Female Mayors, that should be published, if not next year, then the year after. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the theme of Black women and the reasons why Black women engage in solidarity economic efforts or cooperative economic efforts. And the reason is because Black women have been victims of discrimination, just like Black men in America, and that has prohibited them from getting loans from American financial institutions in the past. That discrimination continues in present day. I want to talk about the Freedom Farm Collective, which took place or was founded in the 1960s, and a very dynamic woman by the name of Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who founded the Freedom Farm Collective. And then I want to end by talking about just some of the recent efforts based on a chapter that I wrote with one of my colleagues, whose name is Dr. Tatiana Benjamin. She's at James Madison University. We recently wrote a book, a chapter that will be in our edited book that talks about women in New York and also in Washington, D.C., and the way that these savings efforts are not just for women who are poor. They now have become efforts that are now for women of all classes, including wealthier women. So what exactly is solidarity economics? And when I say that Black women participate in solidarity economic efforts, what am I talking about? The definition pretty much is the same as the title, is when people are working together in solidarity with each other to profit each other financially, and also they work together in communities where they sometimes have been deprived of various political and economic rights. Men and women engage in these solidarity efforts, but today I want to talk mostly about African American women, because we hear a lot about women in other countries, women of color, but we don't really hear very much about women in America and the way that they work together to save money and to enhance themselves financially. And also, this is a way that women, as I'll say today, are fighting against something called racial capitalism, which was written about in a book entitled Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition by the late Cedric Robinson. This was a groundbreaking book in 1983 in which he defined racial capitalism as the capitalist system in America and the racist aspects of it. The fact that in America, because of capitalism, many whites have profited, especially wealthier whites, but they profited from the exploitation of Black labor. So when women work together to save money, to pool their resources, to enhance themselves financially, they're fighting against racial capitalism, or they're fighting against the exploitation of Black labor, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So racial capitalism pretty much has always placed Black people at the bottom of the economic ladder. And the reason has been because of the racism that existed in this country. And even after a lot of those racist barriers were removed and those racist laws were changed, nevertheless, African Americans still were disadvantaged economically and have had a difficult time in building wealth in America. And a lot of that is because of the capitalist system. So there have been blatant efforts that existed throughout our nation's ugly history, beginning with slavery and continuing in the years afterwards. But even in recent years, there have been more hidden efforts to try to discriminate against Black women, to make it harder for Black women to get loans and to amass financial resources. I want to talk a little bit about something else called fringe banking. This is a banking system that is a process of borrowing that charges high interest rates and leaves the borrowers in a cycle that they can never get out of debt. They can never pay off their loans because of the interest that's so high. And so especially a lot of people from lower incomes tend to be most exploited by fringe banking systems, because these are people who are in desperate need of money for something like, let's say if a health crisis happened, or if you lose your job and you really are in desperate need to get money, even if it means you know that you're being charged a high interest rate. Those are the people who are exploited with fringe banking system. And so usually it's a case in which you can never really pay off the debt. And then also they only give you a small loan for a short period of time. And that means that you sometimes have to borrow yet another loan, which puts you even further in debt. Banking deserts is another form of discrimination against men and women in America that disproportionately impacts Black men and women. And that means basically that there is a desert in poor Black communities, in the sense that there are very few banks there. Banks are more likely to close at much higher rates in majority minority neighborhoods, majority Black and majority Hispanic neighborhoods. That should say between 2009 and 2014, communities of color in America lost half of their banking branches. This is something that's important simply because there are very few banks in Black communities. And so that means that if you want to go to a bank to try to get some kind of loan, that means usually that you have to travel quite, I guess, a far distance. And so that also is something that puts people of color, especially poor people, at a disadvantage, because there are so few banks there that they end up having to engage in fringe banking and go and get payday loans and other types of things in order to try to meet their financial needs. I now want to talk a little bit about the exploitation of Black women's labor. And just over then why I'm focusing on Black women specifically, because Black women and men have been disadvantaged, but Black women have had their labor exploited, and little is known about that. Black women tend to lead all women in labor force participation. So in other words, Black women work at higher rates or in higher percentages than women of other races. Yet a quarter of Black women in America live in poverty, live at or below the poverty line. Even though Black women are becoming increasingly college educated, there are probably more college educated Black women than Black men. Nevertheless, they tend to earn the lowest pay. So even when a Black woman has an advanced degree, she tends to earn less money than people from other racial and ethnic groups, and men and women from other racial and ethnic groups. Last year, due to COVID-19, the unemployment rate for Black women rose from 5.4% to 12.7%. And that's higher than all other racial and ethnic women. So Black women work, but unemployment was a big problem beginning with the COVID crisis. And as I already have mentioned, Black women now are the lowest paid workers in America. If you look at just the average pay that a Black woman receives, she usually is paid much less than Black men and men and women of other races. But there are other issues as well that affect Black women financially. And one issue is with the health disparities that plague Black women. They're 4 times more likely to die from childbirth than white women. Black women are more likely to have high blood pressure, and they're also more likely to live in places that have inadequate maternity wards and inadequate health facilities. That affects them financially as well, because that means that sometimes that if their health isn't good, they can't work. And then also that means that at times that they might have medical bills that they can't pay, and they might be desperate to get money and engage in fringe banking so that they can get the kind of loans that they need. So why does solidarity economics matter? In other words, why is it important for Black women to work together to enhance themselves financially? One reason is because this is a way for them to rebel against discrimination. In countries around the world, Black men and women have sort of pooled their financial resources, have worked together in money pools and other solidarity economic efforts, sort of to enhance their economic gain. And then even more importantly than that, it's a way to address the discrimination that I've mentioned in the banking industry, the inability to get loans, the lack of banks in Black neighborhoods. This is a way of them to sort of use, I guess, a self-help type of strategy to help themselves rather than relying on a financial industry that oftentimes discriminates against them. So by engaging in efforts like ROSCAS, which stands for Rotating Savings and Credit Associations, and money pools, by pooling their money together, Black women and men as well gain a sense of self-determination and self-pride. It shows them that despite the discrimination that they have to sometimes deal with, this is an option for them to be able to get to use the people in their communities and work with those people to enhance their resources. So why else does solidarity economics matter? Because it gives them a sense of independence. And that's something that's very important for women, regardless of whether they're wealthier or poor. Many of these women reside in communities where they have to deal with discrimination on the basis of their race, but also on the basis of their gender as well. And so as a result of a combination of racism and sexism, they're doubly disadvantaged. So because so many Black women heavily rely on their male family members, especially their husbands, their boyfriends, their fathers, they need to find ways to have independent sources of money so that they won't have to be so dependent on the men in their families. And so these solidarity efforts provide them with opportunities to have their own money without having to go to someone else to get the money that they need to take care of themselves and their families. They also benefit from initiatives to help them in particular to take care of their children, because this especially is something that's helpful for women who are single mothers. Many Black women, I would say probably the majority of Black women in America, are single lead female headed households. They head their households. So basically it's just them and their children. So this provides them with independence, and it provides them with the money that they need to take care of their children. So by pooling their money and by engaging in solidarity economic efforts, they're able to bypass these banks and these financial industries that traditionally has refused to lend money to them for various reasons. I now want to talk about a woman that I admire very much. Her name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'm sure after I show you this brief video, you will admire her just as much as I do. She is a woman who was one of the, I guess, the unsung, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement that we know very little about, especially in the state of Mississippi, where my parents are from. She was an activist, but she was an activist not just there, but around the country. But she began her activism in the state of Mississippi, and she influenced her community to pool their resources together while at the same time fighting for voting rights, other types of political rights, citizenship rights. She went through a lot of abuse, as I'll show you in a clip in a minute. And she wanted, in particular, Black men and women to have their own economic capital, to have their own money, because she lived in what was called the most racist state in America because of the poverty of most of the Black people who lived there, and also because of the environment of terror, the way that she was treated throughout her life. She was born in 1917 in a small community in Mississippi. She lived in poverty all her life. She died at the age of 59 in 1977, but she developed a Freedom Farm Collective in 1969 that I'll talk about. But first I want to show you a clip that's approximately 12 minutes that talks about Mrs. Hamer. That's a biography that talks about her life and just the tragic life that she lived, but just the fact that she was quite a fighter.
Fannie Lou Hamer. These beatings and even forced sterilization.
All right, I want to stop and make sure that you can hear this, because I always forget to share the sound. And I think I probably forgot, but now I'll start it over. Well, I'll go ahead and continue. You should be able to hear it if you couldn't hear it before.
Life story of Fannie Lou Hamer. Born on October 6, 1917 in Montgomery County, Mississippi, Fannie Lou was the 20th and youngest child of Lou Ella and James Townsend. Both Lou Ella and James worked as sharecroppers their entire lives. When Fannie Lou was just 6 years old, she joined them despite having endured a bout of polio just a year earlier. Hamer was 8 years old in 1925 when she saw Joe Pullum, a local sharecropper, lynched. In an interview with Jack Odell in 1965, she said, "I remember that until this day, and I won't forget it." Poverty forced Hamer to drop out of school at the age of 12, and by the age of 13, she was picking as much as 400 pounds of cotton in a day and receiving $1 for her work. Since Hamer had learned how to read and write during her brief time in school, she also worked as a record keeper on the plantation and soon discovered just how the owners would cook the books to cheat the poor sharecroppers out of their fair wages. To offset this, Hamer began secretly tilting the scales to ensure people weren't cheated. She later recalled, "I didn't know what to do, and all I could do was rebel in the only way I could rebel." In 1944, Fannie Lou married Perry Pap Hamer, a tractor driver on a local plantation. 17 years later, in 1961, she underwent surgery to remove a small cyst in her stomach. When she woke, she discovered that she'd also been given a hysterectomy without her consent. According to PBS, this type of forced sterilization was so common at the time that it became referred to as a Mississippi appendectomy, a term coined by Hamer herself. On June 8, 1964, Hamer testified before a panel in Washington, D.C. that at the North Sunflower County Hospital, 6 out of the 10 Negro women that go to the hospital are sterilized with the tubes tied. Forced sterilizations have a dark history and an equally dark present in the United States. Indiana passed the first forced sterilization law in 1907. And while they hit their peak in the 1930s and 1940s, targeting those deemed to be criminals or unfit by the 1950s, sterilization laws started targeting welfare recipients as well. Forced sterilizations were frequently racially motivated. This became abundantly clear when Mississippi proposed a bill that would make it a felony for a parent on welfare to have more than one child. Jail time could be avoided if the parent consented to sterilization. Ultimately, sterilization was removed from that bill, but untold women like Hamer still were sterilized without their consent. On August
Outdoorsy is a service that connects RV owners with RV renters like us. Once you put that key in the ignition,
August 31st, 1962, Hamer and 17 others went to the courthouse in Indianola, Mississippi to register to vote. According to PBS, most of the group was blocked from even attempting to register. Only Hamer and one other man were allowed to fill out an application and take a literacy test. At the time, literacy tests were purposefully designed to keep Black people from voting. And when Hamer was asked to explain de facto laws, she later recalled that, "I knowed as much about de facto law as a horse knows about Christmas Day." After failing the literacy test, the group was denied the right to register to vote. On the way home, their bus was stopped by police and fined $100 for being too yellow. Then the persecution got worse. The owner of the plantation where Hamer worked and lived demanded that she withdraw her application to vote.
Mr. Marlowe told me that I would have to go down and withdraw my registration or leave because they wasn't ready for that in Mississippi.
Hamer refused and was immediately thrown off the plantation where she had lived and worked for 18 years. She temporarily stayed with a friend before finding a new home, and just narrowly missed being murdered by those who were trying to suppress the Black vote.
They shot in the house 15 times thinking that I was there.
On January 10, 1963, Hamer was finally able to pass the literacy test. According to The Nation, after her second attempt on December 4th, she told the registrar, quote, "You'll see me every 30 days till I pass." A month later, she passed. But despite now being registered to vote, she discovered that she still wasn't allowed to vote because she didn't have any poll tax receipts. In some parts of the United States, people were required to pay a tax in order to vote. A tax put in place to ensure that the poorest people, who were often people of color, didn't get a voice in the government. And they weren't subtle about this fact either. For instance, in 1939, Alabama's Tuscaloosa News published an editorial that read in part, "This newspaper believes in white supremacy, and it believes that the poll tax is one of the essentials for the preservation of white supremacy." In 1962, the United States passed the 24th Amendment, which outlawed poll taxes for federal elections. Despite this, Hamer was still denied the right to vote a year later because it wasn't really enforced until 1965. And to this day, 8 states, including Mississippi, still haven't ratified the amendment. While Pap worked to pay off their sharecropping debt at the plantation, Hamer continued working toward voter registration and desegregation. On June 9, 1963, Hamer and 9 other activists were returning on a bus from a voter registration and civic education training session in Charleston, South Carolina. The activists had tried to integrate lunch counters at the various bus stations along their way home, and their protest had enraged their bus driver. According to Fannie Lou Hamer, America's Freedom-Fighting Woman by Megan Parker Brooks, the driver began using the phone at every stop, reporting their location to Mississippi police. In Winona, Mississippi, police arrested at least 6 of the activists, even those who'd remain on the bus, and took them to jail. Hamer and her fellow activists weren't released from jail until June 12th. And in those 3 days, Hamer sustained such severe and prolonged beatings that she suffered from lifelong damage to her kidneys, eyes, and legs. In addition to beating the activists themselves, police also forced the other Black people who were also imprisoned in the jail at the time to beat the activists as well. While there was later a brief trial, the police were cleared for their actions. After several failed attempts to work with the all-white pro-segregation Mississippi Democratic Party, Hamer co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and in 1964, she went to the Democratic National Convention in an attempt to get representation. As a result, she received death threats. When she reported them to the police, they told her, quote, "Don't look to us for help." On August 22, 1964, Hamer testified before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention. She started by stating her full name and home address, defiantly signaling her fearlessness to every white supremacist. According to the Washington Post, President Johnson was terrified that her testimony at the convention would break up the coalition of white Southern delegates he needed to get elected. He tried to convince her not to speak, but when she did anyway, he abruptly called a pointless live press conference so the TV broadcast would have to cut away from Hamer's testimony. It backfired, bringing more media attention to Hamer's testimony than it otherwise might have gotten, with many evening news programs giving full coverage of the speech that Johnson had interrupted.
Because our lives be threatened dead, because we want to live as decent human beings in America.
As a result of pressure from President Johnson and vice presidential candidate Hubert Humphrey, the convention refused to accept Hamer as an official delegate. Instead, officials offered a farcical compromise to the MFDP. They'd be allowed 2 delegates, but they could neither sit in the Mississippi section, nor would they be able to cast votes. Oh, and neither one of those seats were allowed to go to Hamer. Why? According to Humphrey, the president has said he will not let that illiterate woman speak on the floor of the Democratic Convention. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party voted unanimously to reject the administration's compromise. In Hamer's words, quote, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. They returned to Mississippi, shut out once again by a process meant to empower them." In 1964, Hamer also ran unsuccessfully for Congress. According to an interview with Jack Odell, Hamer recalled that it was harder for her to pass the literacy test in order to register to vote than it was for her to qualify to run for Congress. And despite being barred from the official ballot, the MFDP gave out freedom ballots that included candidates of all races. According to Smithsonian Magazine, after her first bid was unsuccessful, Hamer ran for office 2 more times in 1967 and 1971. Unfortunately, her 1967 run was disqualified on a technicality, and she lost to the incumbent in 1971. She did have one moment of triumph, though. In 1968, the Democratic Party began requiring equal representation for state delegations, and she finally was recognized as an official delegate from Mississippi at the National Democratic Party Convention. She used her platform to protest the ongoing war in Vietnam. Seeing that not much progress was being made on the political front, Fannie Lou Hamer turned most of her attention toward economic justice as a way to fight for racial equality. In 1969, Hamer founded the Freedom Farm Cooperative in order to provide Black people with land that they could own and farm collectively. With the help of donors such as the Measure for Measure organization and Harry Belafonte, by 1970, the co-op had amassed 680 acres for cultivation. Membership for the co-op was $1 a month, and even though only 30 families could afford the dues, those who couldn't pay weren't excluded. Roughly an additional 1,500 families were also part of the Freedom Farm Cooperative in name. In 1970, the collective also started a pig bank for impoverished families. With help from the National Council of Negro Women, the collective purchased 5 male pigs and 35 female pigs. And over the next 3 years, thousands of pigs made their way to Black families. Hamer especially loved the pig bank, stating that, quote, "I wouldn't take nothing for our golden pigs." Unfortunately, without institutional backing or resources, the Freedom Farm Collective only lasted a handful of years. But at its height, it was one of the largest employers in Sunflower County, Mississippi. According
Okay.
I just love.
Okay, I think my screen sharing is paused. At least that's what it says. So I'll go ahead and stop there. But I wanted you to hear about the Freedom Farm Collective. So I'll go ahead and continue with my presentation. All right, so that gives you an idea. And if you would like to get a copy of this presentation, please email me and let me know. In Mississippi, land was very important because land was equated with wealth. And the more land you own, the greater the probability that you would live and be wealthy. And so for many years in the state's history, African Americans were prohibited from owning land. And there were written laws that kept African Americans from owning land. So Mrs. Hamer started the Freedom Farm Collective in 1969. She purchased 40 acres of land in a small town called Rouville, Mississippi, and she received a donation from a group that was a charitable organization that was helping them. And eventually they had a total of 640 acres of land. And so this was really important because so few African Americans owned land in 1969 because for so many years they weren't allowed to own land. And so they were able to use this land to farm and to not only to farm things that they could use to gain some wealth, but also they were able to use it to farm vegetables and other things that they could use to try to help other members of the community. So when she first founded the Freedom Farm Collective in 1969, she said the time has come now when we are going to have to get what we need ourselves. We may get a little help here and there, but in the main, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And that was what the purpose of the Freedom Farm Collective was. But even more importantly, this was one of the first efforts by a Black woman to engage in a solidarity economic effort that she used to enhance her community. So as the film showed, and I hope you could hear it, the cost of membership was $1, but they didn't exclude people who couldn't afford to pay it. Eventually, 1,500 families belonged to the Freedom Farm, and they were able to take advantage of the crops and also the money that they were able to make. Although it wasn't a whole lot, they were able to have cash crops like soybeans and cotton, and they used that to pay their taxes and also to pay their staff. But mostly they grew a lot of vegetables, and they wanted to make sure that people who lived in poverty had healthy food to eat. So that was something that was very important about the collective. But even more important is that it was committed to having people participate, grassroots participation. So this is a quote from Mrs. Hamer: "All the qualifications that you have to become part of the only qualification, I guess, that you have to become part of the co-op is that you have to be poor. This is the first kind of program that has ever been sponsored in the country in letting local people do their thing themselves." So it was designed to empower poor people. Also, the video talked briefly about a pig bank, and they had pigs that they would use because a lot of people who lived in rural poverty in Mississippi didn't have access to meat. So they were able to do that to enhance their diet as well. So for more information on Mrs. Hamer, there are several books that have been written in recent years. And also the link at the top has a summary of different articles that have been written about this extraordinary woman. A book that I'm using in my class was just published a few months ago in 2021 by Professor Keisha Blaine of the University of Pittsburgh. Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America was published by Beacon Press recently, and these are other titles. I also want to talk about African-American banker ladies for the remaining few minutes that I have. This presentation is about 40 minutes. I think I've been talking for about 30 minutes, so I only have like maybe about 10 minutes left. So what exactly is a banker lady? This is a strategy that a lot of women in Canada and other countries have used to assist their communities. These are women who especially assist women who are immigrants, who are new to a country, who need to get grounded, who are not familiar with a new country, who have no credit history, who find it even harder to get any kind of assistance from banks. Also, these tend to be women of color, and also these tend to be women who tend to be poor. So a banker lady assists these women in getting settled and getting a credit history and getting money. It's sort of like them setting up their own banks and running their own banks. I've already given the definition of ROSCAs, rotating savings and credit associations. These also empower women financially. They're similar to banks in the sense that they allow people to be able to save, allow people to be able to have a sense of credit. They allow women to enhance their economic capital and their social capital as well, which I'll define in a minute. At times in communities where they sometimes lack political rights, many times they're not citizens, but even if they are citizens, they sometimes are disadvantaged politically. So how have Black women in American cities used these ROSCA-like strategies to their benefit? That's a question that I discuss in a chapter in a book that I'll tell you about in a minute, that I mentioned even at the beginning of the presentation, that will be published by Oxford University Press, entitled Beyond Racial Capitalism. And so we look at this question, and I want to talk a little bit about a woman named Marie Claire, who is a Haitian immigrant. She is known as Brooklyn's reigning queen of susus. It's mostly consisting of women who are African and Caribbean, and is based in Brooklyn, New York. And she is someone who is a trusted member of the community. In 2011, she had two different funds. One had $20,000, the other had $10,000 that people were able to contribute to. And after they contributed a certain amount of money, as it explains here, each person would put in a certain amount of money during a certain time. And then after they amassed a certain amount of money, each participant in this group would get a savings and would get the pooled money together. This is designed to empower women in many ways, especially financially, so that they can get money, but in other ways as well. Many of these women at times are in abusive relationships, exploited by the men in their lives or the people in their lives, and it gives them the money to get out of those types of situations. These are women who are less likely to be able to get approved for credit or approved for a loan from a bank or from another financial institution. And this allows them to avoid being humiliated by being denied, because they can go to a place with someone that they trust and they can get the resources that they need. So that is one example of something that I wrote about in my upcoming book. But another example is a woman named Fonta Gilliam, and she also has a group in Washington, D.C. that's a Solidarity Economic, a savings group, but it's more sophisticated. So typically when we think of these savings efforts, we tend to think of women who are poor, but she founded something in 2015, and she now is the CEO of an organization that has banks in both Washington, D.C. and also in New York City. And this is a way of having a sort of a more modernized susu. And so, as she has said, this isn't a module that we invented. This is a model that 80% of the world uses. What we're doing is modernizing it and scaling it. It's one of the few things that's proven to work regardless of country. The idea of using village savings and loan models and using peer accountability encourages people to save. So in other words, it uses, as she says here, peer accountability to get people to pay into the circle. We track the positive credit they're building from the loan to the credit rating agencies to help them build their credit. So they're able to pool their money together. They're able to, I guess, improve their credit score, and they're able to use that credit score. And this company helps them to give that credit score to a credit agency, and that helps them to build their credit. It's been used in both Tanzania and also in the United States. It's designed to help people who have poor credit histories or people who have difficulty in getting loans so that they can borrow the money that they need. And it also allows them to get a credit line with a legitimate bank. It's mostly for women, but men are allowed to participate as well. But women have mostly, African-American women or women of African descent have mostly participated in this effort. And they also have an app that allows them to use banks after they build their credit score. They then find a bank that's in the app that assists them. Some women have been able to start their own businesses by participating in this. And so they've received a number of different benefits. But the question is, how do you avoid corruption and fraud? And this is the last thing that I want to talk about. There are different pyramid schemes in America that I guess sort of try to fool people into thinking that they're legitimate, and they solicit donations and they want people to pool their money, but really it's nothing more than just a scam. People will invest their money in it, and it's based on just trying to get people to invest money. And after a certain number of people have invested their money, the pyramid collapses. And so the people who begin at the very beginning of the pyramid tend to get some money, but the people who come in later tend to get nothing. So it's a way for you, it's very fraudulent. It's a way for people to pretty much lose their money. So you have to have a sense of trust in a community in order to participate in the efforts that I've been talking about today. You have to have a sense of social capital, is a term that we use here in America, a sense of community, a sense of trust, a sense of solidarity. The people who are running these money pools and these ROSCAs have to be people that are trusted in the community, and they have to build a sense of solidarity in the community to avoid the fraud. And so usually the women who have, I guess, who are well known, who are trusted in the communities, tend to be in charge of these, and that's how they avoid corruption and fraud. So if you'd like to receive more information about Mississippi and some of the things with Mrs. Hamer, I wrote a book in 2006 entitled The Transformation of Plantation Politics, Concentrated Poverty, Black Politics, and Social Capital in the Mississippi Delta. And these are some other books that talk just in general about collective efforts, about women. In particular, my good friend Caroline Hossein has done a lot of research on this topic. So I just want to thank you and just end with a quote from Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer when she said, guess what? We can't win the political struggle until we have economic independence. And how can we have economic independence? We have to own our own land, control our own food production, and we have to do it through co-ops. So that pretty much explains in a nutshell why cooperatives are so important. If you have any questions or if you'd like to see a copy of this presentation, please contact me. My email address is listed here, polssdw@ufl.edu. And I'm Sharon Austin, Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you today. So thank you all very much.